Once upon a time, a couple had only one child. They lived alone in a deserted valley. One time the mother went into the forest to collect firewood, bringing with her 2-year-old Hans. In the spring, hundreds of diamond flowers bloomed. Mother and child happily walked, going forever into the deep forest without even realizing it. Suddenly 2 robbers jumped out from the bushes on the side of the road. They grabbed the mother and child and led them into the wildest place in the forest, where no one had ever set foot before. The poor mother begged the robbers to release mother and child. The robbers and number 39. Hearts turned to stone. They did not listen to the mother and number 39's pleas. They pushed the 2 to continue. After 2 hours of stepping on trees and thorns on the road, mother and child were pushed to the door located right on the cliff. The robbers knocked on the cliff and the door slowly opened. The mother and child walked along the long dark tunnel, then came to a large cave with a flickering fire shining from the red stove. Hanging on every wall were bows, swords and other murderous objects, glistening in the flickering firelight. A black table was placed in the middle of the cave. 4 people were sitting and playing. The leader of the robbers was sitting nearby. When the mother and child entered the cave, the leader came and said, "Don and number 39. T worry, Don and number 39. T be afraid. Your daily job is to take care of food and clean everything neatly." Then the bandits gave food to the mother and child and showed them a place to sleep. The mother and daughter lived for many years in the robbers and number 39 place. Hans has grown up now. The mother often told Hans stories about knights in a book. That book she found in the cave. She also often taught Hans how to read and write. When he was 9 years old, Hans took a cypress branch and twisted it into a large rope and hid it under his bed. Hans came to his mother and said, "Dear mother, tell me who is my father." The mother remained silent, not wanting to tell her child that it would make him miss home again. The mother also knew very well that the robbers would never let Hans leave this place. She was also very hurt when Hans could not visit his father. Late at night, when the robbers returned, Hans took the rope in his hand and walked to the leader of the robbers and said, "I want to know my father and number 39's whereabouts. Say it now, or I and number 39 leave right now." The leader laughed loudly and gave Hans a slap on the ear, causing Hans to roll several times under the table. Hans stood up, thinking, "We have to wait next year, then we can find a way again. Maybe things will be better." Another year passed. Hans took the stick, brushed off the dust, looked closely at it and said, "This stick is solid." Late at night, the bandits returned. They drank bottle after bottle of wine until they were drunk. Hans took out his stick again, stood before the leader and asked him who his father was. The leader gave Hans a slap on the ear, causing Hans to fall under the table, but immediately after that, Hans stood up, raised his stick and hit the head of the leader and the other robbers. They were beaten so painfully that they could not move their limbs. The mother stood in a corner and was very surprised to see Hans so brave. After punishing the bandits, Hans walked up to his mother and said, "Now it and number 39's my business. Now I want to know who my father is." The mother replied, "Dear child, now we will go look for your father, search until we meet him." She took the leader and number 39's key to open the cave door. Hans took a very large bag to contain gold, silver and jewels. When the bag was full, Hans carried it on his shoulder. Then mother and child went out of the cave. Coming out of the darkness into the bright sunlight, Hans suddenly opened his eyes wide to look at the green forest, flowers and birds under the bright sunlight. He stood there dumbfounded, watching that scene. The mother and daughter found their way home. After walking for a few hours, the two came to a deserted valley where there was a small house. A man is sitting in front of the house. When he recognized his wife and heard that Hans was his son, he was so happy that he cried. He still thought they had died a long time ago. Although Hans was only 12 years old, he was a head taller than his father. They entered the house together. When Hans put the bag down on the bench by the fireplace, the whole house shook. The couch broke. The ground caved in, causing the heavy bag to fall into the basement. The father exclaimed, "God bless us! What is this? You and number 39, they already demolished the house." Hans replied, "Dear father, you Don and number 39. Have to worry about gray hair. The gold and silver in this bag is enough to build a new house." Father and son immediately started building a new house, buying animals and fields to make a living. Hans gently pushed the plow to turn the soil so the oxen didn't and 39 pull too hard. In the spring of his second year, Hans said, "Father, keep this money, just ask him to make me a stick weighing 100 pounds so I can carry it with me when I travel around the world." After the stick was finished, the young man set out. Hans came to a dark forest and suddenly heard a crackling sound. He looked around and saw a rope wrapped around a pine tree coming down from a high treetop. He looked up and saw a tall young man firmly grasping the tree and pulling, as if twisting a willow. Hans asked, "Hey, what are you doing there?" "Yesterday I found a few piles of firewood, now I use string to tie them up." Hans thought, and quote, "This guy is okay. He and number 39's very strong." And quote. Then Hans called that guy, "Just leave it there, come with me." The boy fell down. He was a head taller than Hans, although Hans was not short. Hans said, "Now call me and quote, Pine Twister and quote." They set off together. Suddenly they heard a loud banging and knocking sound. It made the ground vibrate. Not long after, they came to a large cliff. There was a giant standing in front of the cliff, raising his fist to break large pieces of rock. Hans asked the giant why he did that. He replied, "At night I want to sleep, but bears, wolves and other animals keep wandering around, sniffing around me, making it impossible for me to sleep. So I want to make a room to lie down in peace." Hans thought, and quote, "Oh, I need this person too," and quote, and said to that guy, "Leave that aside, now come with me. My name will be and quote, the guy who broke the cliff and quote." The giant agreed. 3 people walked through a forest. Wherever they went, wild animals panicked and ran away. At night they arrived at an old abandoned castle. They entered a large room and slept there. Early the next morning, Hans went to the abandoned flower garden that was overgrown with grass. He was walking back and forth in the flower garden when a wild pig came rushing towards him. He raised the stick and gave it a blow, causing the pig to turn away. He picked up the pig and brought it into the large room. The 3 of them cut up the pork, grilled it on iron skewers, and enjoyed a delicious meal. They arranged to meet every day. 2 people took turns hunting, and 1 person stayed home to cook, because each person needed to eat up to 4.5 kilograms of meat. On the first day, the guy who twisted the pine tree stayed at home. Hans and the guy who hit the cliff went hunting. The guy who twisted the pine tree was grilling meat when a dwarf with a wrinkled face came into the castle and asked him for some meat to eat. He twisted the pine tree and refused, saying, "You cowardly devil, go away. You Don and number 39, deserve to be eaten." In an instant, that ugly dwarf was on his back, twisting the pine tree, and punching him repeatedly, causing him to fall to the ground and breathe. After being angry, the dwarf left. When the other 2 returned from hunting, the one who twisted the pine tree did not say a word about the dwarf or about being beaten, but thought to himself, "And quot, if they were at home, they would also know the dwarf and number 39's temper." And quot, thinking that, he was secretly happy. The next day, he smashed the cliff at home and encountered the same thing as he twisted the pine tree. Because he did not let the dwarf eat meat, he was also beaten quite a bit. In the evening, when the 2 hunters returned home, he twisted the pine tree and watched him hit the cliff. He immediately knew what had happened, but they both remained silent, thinking, "And quot, let Hans taste that too." And quot. On Tuesday it was Hans and number 39's turn to stay home and work in the kitchen. While the young man was standing with foam in the pot on the stove, the dwarf walked up and asked for a piece of meat to eat. Hans thought, "And quot, this dwarf is so pitiful. Give him your meat so he can eat it, so others 1 and number 39's lose theirs." And quot. So he gave the dwarf a piece of meat. The dwarf finished eating 1 piece and asked for another. Hans kindly gave him another piece of meat, saying it was the last piece. After eating, the dwarf asked for a 3rd piece of meat. "Harmless soldiers," Hans said, and gave nothing more. The ferocious dwarf tried to jump on Hans and number 39's back like the guy who twisted the pine tree and the guy who hit the cliff, punching and kicking. But this time he was wrong. Hans fucked him several times, sending him flying onto the stone steps of the castle. Hans chased after him, ran all the way to the forest and saw the dwarf crawling into a cave. Hans had to go home, but he missed that place. When the other 2 friends returned, it was very strange to see Hans still enthusiastic. Hans told them what had just happened, and they also told them what they had encountered. After listening, Hans smiled and said, "Truly deserving of your stinginess. You guys are so tall and yet you let short people beat you to the front. What a shame." A moment later, the 3 of them carried the basket and rope and went to the cave where the dwarf had crawled down. Hans held the stick and sat in the basket so that the other 2 could use a rope to drop it down. When he reached the bottom of the cave, Hans saw a door. He opened the door and looked in and saw a beautiful young woman like the one in the painting sitting next to the dwarf. He smirked at Hans. The young girl was tightly wrapped in chains. She looked at Hans with pitiful eyes, making him feel sorry for her and think, "And quot, you must save her from the cruel hands of that dwarf." And quot. He swung his stick and made a blow, causing the dwarf to fall to the ground, dead. As soon as the dwarf died, the chains on the young girl immediately fell. Hans was ecstatic at her splendid beauty. The young girl told Hans that she was originally a princess who was taken away from her homeland by a lecherous count and imprisoned in a cave. Because she did not comply with his wishes, he assigned the dwarf to guard her. The dwarf tried every way to disturb her and torture her. Hans let the girl sit in the basket so she could go first. The basket went up and then down again. Now, Hans no longer trusted his two friends. He thought. And quote. Before they lied, what happened to the dwarf they refused to tell me. Now who knows they are still lying. And quote. What trick is this to harm me? And quote. Thinking so, he put the stick in the basket. That was also lucky for him, because when the basket was pulled up halfway, the other two guys let it fall. If Hans had been sitting in that basket, he would have died. But now Hans doesn't and #39 know how to get out of the cave bottom. He thought and thought but could not find a way. He muttered, "Looking at me struggling miserably at the bottom of the cave makes people feel sorry for me." He walked back and forth, then came to the room where the girl was sitting, and saw the dwarf wearing a sparkling ring on his finger. He took off the ring, put it on his hand, twirled it around on his finger when suddenly he heard a noise above his head. He looked up and it turned out there were several demons flying in the air. They said Hans was their master, and asked him if he had any requests. At first Hans didn't and #39 know what to say, but after a while he said they had to take him out of the cave. As soon as he reached the ground, he looked around and saw no one. When he entered the old castle, he saw no one. The guy who twisted the pine tree and the guy who hit the cliff both ran away, taking the beautiful girl with them. Hans immediately turned the ring and the demons flew to him, telling him that those two men were at sea. Hans ran quickly to the beach, saw a small boat offshore. Sitting on the boat were two evildoers. Without thinking any more, Hans took the stick in his hand, immediately jumped into the water, and swam. But the heavy stick pulled him down deep, causing him to almost drown. Then Hans suddenly remembered and turned the ring. In the blink of an eye, the demons flew again, taking him to the small boat. He swung his stick to punish the two scoundrels, and threw them into the sea. Once again Hans saved the young girl. He turned the boat around, carried the frightened beautiful girl back to her parents and number 39 house, and he and her were married, and everyone was very happy. Thank you for joining us for today's fairy tale. We hope these stories bring joy and meaning to your day. If you love our channel, please hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any exciting tales. Wishing you a good night and sweet dreams. See you in the next story.